Welcome. This is Writer to Writer, and I'm Brenda Simmons, your host. We are certainly pleased today to have a very special guest with us, the writer, Mr. Clifton Taulbert. And we're going to just chat for a few moments today about several of his works. He has written about his life in the South, his journey to the North, his experiences in the armed services, and generally his view of life in America. I'd like to introduce our audience to Mr. Clifton Taulbert.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you this day.
Thank you. I'd like us to begin this journey with what you call the 8 habits of the heart. You have several books that I'd like for you to just list for us initially, and then tell us about those 8 habits of the heart and how they permeate all of your works.
Well, you know, when I started writing, I realized that more than just writing words, I had this incredible opportunity to write people, to write their lives. And when I was in Belgium, I was asked the question, how can we take Papa Joe Young from Glen Allen, Mississippi, Mama Pearl, Mr. Fields, Mama Punk, Mrs. Knight, these people who populated my world, and make them universal. And that's when I began to look at their actions, what had really made them, what moved them. And their actions and ideals became my 8 habits of the heart: nurturing attitude, responsibility, dependability, friendship, brotherhood, high expectations, courage, and hope. Those 8 ideals represents the life actions of an incredible group of people.
I'd really like to just dwell just a moment on those 8 habits, because they are certainly strong values that families live by. You spoke of a nurturing attitude. Who nurtured you the most?
Well, you know, when I started writing, once upon a time when we were colored, I simply wanted to write a thank you note. And to these ordinary people who had taken good care of me. And when I began to look at what my life had turned out to be, I really couldn't take a lot of credit for what had happened. And I began to go back to the Mississippi Delta. And in so doing, I encountered my grandfather. And nurturing attitude was the representation of his ability to put many of his desires on hold so that he could give me vision for the future. He spent time with me. So when I think in terms of a nurturing attitude, I think in terms of people who are willing to spend time with the future. And the only way you can take care of the future is by doing the best stuff today.
Thank you. What about responsibility?
Responsibility, as I indicated, these aren't words in the dictionary. First of all, they're all people. And I laughingly tell people that responsibility does not come under the R section of the dictionary. It looks just like Uncle Cleve, the Iceman, in Glen Allen, Mississippi. But then again, it looks just like people all over the world who have this unique opportunity to involve themselves in the lives of other people on a consistent basis until that person becomes thoroughly involved and knowledgeable about what is going on and understands their relationship to that project.
I am truly inspired by this, because every time I give you one of these words, you associate it with a person, as you have told us. So let's continue. Dependability. Who's that?
Dependability, when I think about it, and I often ask young kids, when I say young kids, high school, whatever, how does dependability look to you? And invariably, it will be the action of a person. So when you tie that action to the person, dependability, again, does not pop out of the dictionary as much as it pops out of our life. And for me, it looked just like my great aunt who raised me in the Mississippi Delta, because the school systems were segregated at the time. And I had to travel 100 miles round trip to school, but that really didn't bother her to the fact that it kept her from doing the thing that she had to do for me. She got up every morning for 4 years and flipped the porch light so that the bus driver would know that I'd be going to school. So when I think of dependability, I think of a person who's there for you through all the times of your life, making tomorrow a welcomed event.
And I'm remembering what you said earlier when you said that your first book was a thank you note, and you found that you couldn't take credit for much of what happened to you. And as you continue to attach a name to these values, again, it has definitely left an indelible mark on your life that these people have made an impression on you. What about friendship and brotherhood?
I think all of the 8 habits of the heart, really, literature has given me an opportunity to give a long-lasting life, not just to the people that I knew in the Mississippi Delta. I remember being in Scotland and sitting at his wonderful dinner, and they were talking about Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet, and comparing what he had written about the ordinary life in Scotland as compared to the ordinary life that I had written about in the Mississippi Delta. And in the course of the conversation, we began to come up with parallels that had crossed the North Sea, that had crossed the Atlantic, in that these habits of the heart are timeless and universal, not held captive by race, gender, or geography. And friendship in the Mississippi Delta looked the same in Scotland as it does anywhere around the world. It's always a person.
Is it a fair guess then to say that high expectations are associated with a teacher?
For teachers who are listening, I would say, well, of course, but high expectations really, it gives each person the opportunity to understand that as human beings, part of this family of humanity, we're hooked up. We're hooked together. And if I really want to see myself succeed, I cannot do that without wishing your success as well. Even though we may live in different places at different times, but the mere fact that we share this front room called the planted earth, it means that I have the responsibility and this absolutely wonderful time to wish well for you as well as I would for myself. So high expectation is being there, the ability to praise others, tell them how to do something, and when they have done well, praise them for having done so.
But I guess where I was going with that was there perhaps a teacher in your life who reinforced the expectations that your parents
Are you
had
a teacher?
of you? Absolutely.
I think in our country where education has been, for the most part, so accessible to most people, I doubt very seriously, from the highest office in the land to the person who chops cotton or whatever one does, that our life has not been influenced and impacted by a teacher.
That's true. Your last two, Courage and Hope, sort of transition us to your second book, which is The Last Train North. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you spoke about your life in the North. Could you talk about the mythological North and the realities that you found when you traveled there?
Well, like I said, when I wrote Once Upon a Time, I simply wanted to say thank you to the people who had taken good care of me while growing up in the Mississippi Delta. But also while there, I had dreamed of going to the North because there were pictures on our mantle of cousins and aunts and uncles who had gone to Chicago, New York, Detroit, and they all looked good. And you know, it just created this picture in the mind of a young boy. If I could just get that train, which my great aunt said was the best mode of transportation. She said never ride a bus. She said a bus would pick up a dead person. But so I was definitely wanting to get the train. And I actually did ride the last passenger train out of the Mississippi Delta, going on my way to my northern city, which at the time was St. Louis, Missouri. But of course, that's what a dream is. A dream allows you to create in your mind what you think is there based upon tidbits of information, visitors from the North, portraits that they would send back, letters that would come. So over the years, I had built up a fantasy world, a world that lived in high-rise buildings, a world that lived on large lakes, a world that lived on grassy knolls and 2- and 3-story homes, just this incredible world where people were somehow connected, and there existed equity, and there existed the types of things that I did not know as a young boy growing up in the segregated South. But unfortunately, at the end of the train ride, upon my arrival in St. Louis, I found St. Louis not to be that different than Mississippi. I found that many of the things that I had encountered as a young boy growing up there also existed in St. Louis, that the world was not as integrated as I had thought it to be, that life did not have all of the things of inclusiveness in the North that I had thought was there. But again, I found, strange it might seem, that I was able to meander throughout the North, not because I had come to this mythological city, but because of the care and the love and the life support that had been given me while growing up in the South.
You use the term meandered through the North. Can you talk to us about your travels in the North? You landed in St. Louis. You got a job as a painter?
Well, no, well, not really. When I got to St. Louis, first of all, I was totally impressed with the train station, because I feel very fortunate to have been at that end of an era. I was born at a time that allowed me to have one foot in a segregated world, one foot in the beginning of integration, and at the other, also the beginning and ending of that wonderful world of trains and large train stations. So coming to St. Louis, the train was the most impressive thing for me. Being able to sit there and being able to watch the tons of people come in and out of my life as I waited. But as I went into the city of St. Louis, eyes wide open, paved streets all the way, street lights, large brick homes. These were the types of things that I had not seen. So when I began to write the book, The Last Train North, I wasn't really just writing the story of a young black Southern kid from the Mississippi Delta, but I was writing the story of people no matter where they are. When you live in a small place, you have dreams, and all of a sudden you're there, and many of the physical things that you had dreamed about, they were present in St. Louis. The big buildings, the large department stores, the large downtown. And for a couple of weeks, perhaps even a few months, I lived in a totally mesmerized world. I remember writing a letter that the apartments were so big that the sun couldn't even find a place to shine.
I bet that was quite a contrast for you.
Yes, definitely, because in the South, the cotton rows go on and on and on, and large spaces of land, and it was different.
Yes.
It was quite different.
Well, let's come back for a moment to the South and just tickle your fancy a little bit with some of the phrases that mean something to you. I understand that in some audiences you have to stop and explain what light bread and sweet milk is all about. Talk to us about that.
Well, that's one of the nice things about the American South. We have somehow managed to maintain this incredible culture within the United States. And within that culture, there exists terminology that only Southerners understand, and it causes us to rise and salute whether there's a flag present or not. And I remember I was in New York, speaking at New York University, and I was talking about my dinner that I would have with the lady who employed me, and she would have baked chicken, light bread, and sweet milk. And everyone looked quizzical when I said light bread and sweet milk. So I thought I'd ask. I said, has anyone ever heard of this before? And of course no one had. So I had to detour for about 30 minutes to explain to my audience what light bread meant and what sweet milk tastes like. But that's part of the neat thing about writing, because whether we read the works of Robert Burns, whether we read the works of Maya Angelou, whether we read the works that comes from South Africa, wherever, there will always be terms that speak specifically of the culture. Mm-hmm. But you know, those terms and those cultural nuances were not there as fences, if you will, but I see them as incredible invitations to know more about the person and to feel that, light bread. Is that something that only a Southerner could eat? But once you begin to understand what light bread is, you realize that there is a variation of light bread all over the world.
Absolutely. You speak of comparisons with other writers. You talk about the front porch experience of the Mississippi Delta. How does that compare to the porch experiences of Zora Neale Hurston's writings, for example?
I believe that the porch is the place, is the stage, but I think in Zora Neale's writing, my writings, or the writings of any people who speak in terms of other people who are smart enough to recognize their connectiveness to the younger generation. And I think that is what we're really trying to say, is that the front porches provided place in which to carry this connectiveness out. But in my case in the South, my grandparents were not privileged to be part of the places of prestige and power. So the front porches became those places. And they were more than just a place for my grandfather to hold the rocking chair and to have a social ice cream being made, but it was also the place where they saw their future through the lengthening steps of their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And I think that when other writers write about the front porch experience, I think what they're really telling us is that we remember a time when unselfishness was very important in the lives of people.
Unselfishness, good word. Can you just describe, give us a vignette, if you will, of that front porch? Who's sitting there? What's being said? Give us an idea of the philosophical, what phrases that you would hear or that young people would be inspired by.
Saturday morning in the Mississippi Delta, Papa Joe Young is getting ready to shave. Well, he always shaves on Saturday morning, and I have the opportunity to watch him. So I go and hide behind the Davenport as my great-grandfather, who is not brown or nutmeg or chocolate. Papa is really very black. And he fills the chair, and then my great-grandmother walks in with this big basin filled with water, the little cup with a whisk broom. And all of a sudden, this wonderful black face began to change in front of me as my grandfather put soap all over his face and head. And then he takes the razor, expertly handled, and began to remove the soap from his face, creating the shiny image of Buddha that I had come to love. So while my grandfather is finishing this careful process of dressing, I go and sit on the front porch. With my knees pulled up to my chin, I look as far as I can, and I can only see as far as Greenfield, a series of cotton farms and sharecroppers' homes. And because I can see no farther, I think Greenfield is the end of my world. But then the screen door opens. Out walks my great-grandfather, suit on, Panama hat, gold watch strapped across his belly, a shining face, a laughter in his eye. And he says, "Clifton, who's ready to go to Greenville?" "I am, Papa." And all of a sudden, the world lights up. The screen door is open. The car is there, the 1949 Buick, which never starts on time. And then my grandmother walks out of the door and said, "Don't forget to stop by Miss Dumps." That was one of the neighbors, and she wants to get something from Greenville, and Papa makes this list of people who wants to get stuff, and then he tells me to go and get in the car, and he turns the ignition. When he gets in, the car doesn't start, but then it never started on time, but it never bothers Papa, so he tells me, "Get out of the car, go break him a Chinaberry stick," and I do this. Then he hits something on the hood with the Chinaberry stick, and the car starts, and away we go to Greenville, 28 miles away, but it takes us 2.5 hours to get there, because my grandfather stops and talks to everybody along the way. The front porch became a place that I would wait, look, and dream. And my grandfather would make those dreams reality by taking me to Greenville, Mississippi. But more happened than just going to the town. I understood from him that it was okay to take a list to Greenville of things that other people wanted. It took him 2.5 hours to get there because he understood that community cannot be made if you do not communicate with people. And you have to take time with people. So that's a typical life lesson from the front porch.
Absolutely. That sounds so idyllic. I have found myself thinking that your books are certainly spring and summertime books. Books that, of course, give you that sense that there is renewal, that there is hope. Could you comment on the letter that is in the front of your book, Watching Our Crops Come In? There's a letter written by Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Well, several years ago, I attended a town hall meeting on my way to hear Robert Kennedy Jr. speak. I never met him before, didn't even know him. So when I got to the place, there was a young white guy standing out, and we were both waiting to hear Robert Kennedy speak. So he and I just talked for, 30 minutes about exercise, all the stuff that guys talk about, except hunting. Never talk to me about hunting. I do not know how to sit, straddle, or hold a gun. But anyway, we talked about everything else, working out, and finally a lady came out and said, Mr. Kennedy, we're ready. And it was Bobby. And we had hit it off really well, and in that short period of time, we exchanged cards, etc. And when my first book came out, Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, of course, he had purchased a copy of it and sent me a very nice letter and said thanks for introducing him to a world that he'd heard about, but I'd made that world very intimate for him. And when I wrote the book, Watching Our Crops Come In, I asked him if he would write the foreword. And I said, I would rather the foreword be a little different. I would rather you write a letter. I said, because I just think letters are such wonderful ways of expressing yourself. And he said he would do that. And of course, he had to read it. And you know, all the things that one do when you write a foreword. But again, I think in the last few lines of his letter, he said that watching our crops come in, it's the story of almost coming full circle, from a young boy who dreamed on the front porches in the Mississippi Delta and Once Upon a Time, taking the last train north to St. Louis. And now I find myself becoming a man in the United States Air Force. Scared to death that I'm going to be sent to Vietnam, learning to write, still dreaming about a world that exists beyond my present set of circumstances. But I think Bobby sums it up really well, that I have tried to keep faith with the world that my grandparents believed in, a world that had not fully recognized them, but a world in which they knew they were intimately involved.
That's wonderful. We're just about out of time. Would you review for our audience your book titles and then end with what you think your gift is to the 21st century?
Well, I've been very fortunate not only to write for major magazines around the country, but to have written Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, which became an international success, The Last Train North, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, Watching Our Crops Come In, which the Los Angeles Times named as one of the top 10 books for this particular time in our lives. And of course, 8 Habits of the Heart, which is being used around the world to study values and to study character and just to study who we are as people. I would say without question that I have become somewhat of a mouthpiece, a spokesperson, perhaps a pickup truck, really, that carries the life lessons of ordinary people. And I think if I give anything in the writing that I do, I tell the world, never underestimate, never overlook, and never undervalue the ordinary lives that are around us, because these are the types of things that hold humanity together.
That's absolutely wonderful. I'm Brenda Simmons, and this has been Writer to Writer.